Okay, everybody, welcome one and all to this episode of the MirYam Institute webinar. We are delighted to have with us two experts, but before I introduce those individuals to you, I want as ever to express my profound thanks to my colleague and co-founder of the MirYam Institute, Rosita Panini. Thank you, Rosita, for everything you do. And I'd also like to thank our colleague in common, Mr. Alan Langer. Now, whether you're listening to this via the podcast or a postcast, or you're seeing this on television, we welcome each and every one of you, and we thank you for granting your attention to a subject that certainly warrants that attention in order to discuss the priorities that the State of Israel and indeed the United States of America ought to affix when confronting the Iranian threat. And that threat comes in many forms and many shapes. We are delighted to have with us Professor Chuck Freilich. Chuck Freilich serves as adjunct professor of political science at Columbia University, as well as at Tel Aviv University. He is a former deputy national security advisor in Israel and a longtime senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, and has taught political science at Harvard, NYU, and Tel Aviv University. He's the author of Zion's Dilemmas: How Israel Makes National Security Policy, Israeli National Security, a New Strategy for an Era of Change, and Israel and the Cyber Threat, How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power. That will be published in 2021. In fact, Chuck, is that published already?
Not yet.
Not yet, but we'll be looking forward to that, and I look forward to interviewing you on that. He's also published numerous academic articles and over 170 op-eds, and he appears frequently on US, Israeli, and international TV and radio stations. Professor Freilich is going to be joined by Major General retired Eitan Dangot. Major General Dangot concluded his extensive career as the coordinator of government activities in the territories, or COGAT, in 2014. Prior to that post, he served as the military secretary to three ministers of defense: Shaul Mofaz, Amir Peretz, and Ehud Barak. He holds a BA in economics and computer science and an MBA, both earned from Bar Ilan University. So with all of that having been said, gentlemen, I am very, very pleased to have you here. I appreciate you, as I said, taking the time to talk to us. And I'm going to actually start off with an excerpt from Professor Freilich's paper, if I may. And Professor, you say the following. I'm going to read a long form quote. You say in response to our interview question, quote, while the debate on how to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear state is lengthy and complex, it's important to keep in mind that the only supreme objective is to indeed prevent Iran from going nuclear. The how is less important than the what, and it is vital to keep the bottom line in sight. Although the US was probably out-negotiated when it, along with other world powers, signed the JCPOA with Iran in 2015, the deal back then was and remains the least worst option in serving the overall objective of keeping Iran from becoming a nuclear-armed state. So my first question, based on that, is a very basic one. Have we somehow lost sight of this bottom line, the importance of preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear weaponized state? Is there a reason that you've urged people to refocus on that, Chuck?
Well, first of all, let me just say, if I may, today is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I can't think of any day that is both more appropriate and more inappropriate for our conversation today. More appropriate because once again, we have a hostile power threatening the existence of the Jewish people, and more inappropriate because the state of Israel was established so that no one could ever again threaten the existence of the Jewish people. And I'd like to start off by saying no one can destroy the Jewish people anymore, or the state of Israel. The days in which we faced an existential threat, even if Iran goes nuclear, and I'll come back to that in 1 second, we can handle that as well. Nobody can destroy us anymore. That is a huge achievement of Israel's national security strategy. And it is something that, as we are about to celebrate our 73rd year of independence, we should be very, very gratified about. The Iranian threat, as you said in your remarks, is a multifaceted one. It's first and foremost a nuclear issue, it's ballistic missiles, it's Iran's regional expansionism, it's the precision project, in other words, the precise missiles that they're supplying to Hezbollah and maybe to Syria and elsewhere. But of the different threats, the only one which is potentially existential is the nuclear one. And that's why I believe that we really do have to keep our eye on the ball and focus first and foremost on that. Now, by no means ignoring the other issues. And as a matter of fact, in the short term, the greatest threat is actually the precision missile threat. They're not nuclear yet. The precision threat is here. The JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal, was based on the assumption, which I think was absolutely correct, I still do, that we should first deal with the nuclear issue and then we can deal with everything else, because that's the existential one. That was the Israeli position in the 90s and early 2000s, at least before I left the government. It was not the position of the prime minister at the time. He said that the deal should have been comprehensive. And from what I understand more recently, it has once again become Israel's preference. Now, obviously, none of us wants to see a nuclear Iran, okay? Left, right, up, down, no one wants to see a nuclear Iran. We have to do everything that we can to prevent this from happening. The question, though, is, do you live in the world that you wish to live in or the world that we really live in? In the world that we really live in, I think that in 2015, the deal was the best of the bad alternatives, and it's probably the same today as well. I think the Biden administration is going back to the deal. That's pretty much a done deal unless the Iranians prevented it at the last minute. And we have two big choices here. I'll conclude with this so you can turn to Eitan, but we have two big choices now. We can either say no, as we did in 2015, and fight it tooth and nail, in which case we will once again be marginalized and have very little impact on what happens. Or we can understand that, well, first of all, we have a debt to the United States that we can never repay, and we have to cooperate just on a moral level, but on a more practical level, if we want to have an impact, we have to get on board and help the administration reach the best deal that is possible.
So, Eitan, having heard what Chuck said, and welcome to you as well, well, first of all, actually, before I come to the question, I know that obviously Yom HaShoah is an issue very close indeed to your heart. Let me ask you, in addition to obviously our thoughts and our prayers and our memories being cast back to the atrocities of the Shoah, are you in agreement? Chuck made a very stirring comment that because of the state of Israel, as a result of our national security achievements, there is no country that can destroy the Jewish people. Is that your view, Eitan?
Thank you for giving me the option to participate in your such important subject. And I also joined to Professor Freilich for what he said, that the day we are talking about, it's a very sensitive and emotionally in-depth day. I'm coming from a family which my father is a survivor from the Shoah. He's more than 90 today. And I studied the Shoah from a different aspect. He escaped from Poland to Russia, and it's a big story. And for me, it's something that gave me even the emotional and the motivation to go on the IDF. I would like to join this part of the discussion by, I agree with what Professor Chuck Freilich said, but what is the but? 2015 is not 2021. And the starting point, even we came back to the Democratic Party, which made this kind of agreement, which is more or less is giving the way that the Democratic Party is looking for the way United States should, let's say, solve the international goals with Iran. I think that we cannot start in such a point by saying that we have to start only with the nuclear. I think that I agree not about the what, but the problem is how. What is changed? It has changed that now we are dealing with three angles. That the top of it is the nuclear, but the base of it is, in my opinion, the accurate weapon arsenal that should be used for the future for nuclear or other threats to Israel, and also for the landhold that Iran has achieved till now, with all the problems that Iran is facing, sanctions, the corona issue, the other problems they are facing, this train of, I compare it to the train to Treblinka, that Iran is moving ahead as a very close goal, and they are not ashamed to say it. So I agreed that Israel is the most strong countries, as my former minister Barak said to me always, we are the strong country, 1,000 kilometers, 1,500 kilometers around us, but we have been on alert and to prevent the fact that Iran will have to choose to threat, and I mean it, about our existence in the future and the way, not on the way to be, that Israel will continue to be a country, the way we are looking about our state, and we have to prevent any kind of threat like Iran. The two closer threats that similar to Iran, Saddam Hussein at 81 and Assad at 2007, you know how it ended. It ended by Israel's own activities to solve this problem. We cannot do it in such a way now, but it's such a comparison to say we cannot agree to all these three angle points that will be divided, a clear divided, like for the nuclear, and then we will see what go on. And I explain why. First of all, the facts on the ground are very, very difficult. And if it continues, it will be much more. The fact that today the route, Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus, and Beirut is one open at mostly way, and from Tehran to Yemen showed you the main development in the Middle East. Secondly, the amount of proxies that are surround us is not something that Israel can allow it to continue to base its place on the ground, operational and logistic. And what I mean, that the outcome of what I said today, just for example, that I'm more and more thinking about Israel, the new government that will be established, I hope very soon, will have to take in account opportunities like preventive war, especially towards the main proxy power in our area, as Hezbollah is the most strong terror militias that is no responsible for a country all over the world, in my opinion. And it's really complete the threat with Iran. So I agreed that we have to divide it maybe as a subject, but we cannot make it blue and white. It's not a mathematic formula, because what we have to do is to increase the weight of the parameters of the formula that compared to 2015, today at 2021, the landhold of Iran around Israel, the new border that Iran succeed to create without being responsible to it from Syria and of course from Lebanon, and who knows their aim for the future. And when you are going back for the weapon system, the accurate weapon system for missiles, together with the weapon is one big subject. The last point for now, just for 1 minute, Benjamin, that compared to 2015, I think that Israel is in a big problem because the United States discussions or activities today is under effect that you have in Israel. It's not a temporary government, but it's a government that is responsible till the new government will be established. And if you're looking when, it will not be before June. And in June, it's the date on the timetable to finish the temporary agreement that United States is planning to do with Iran because of the elections in Iran. So if Israel today is not able to make political on one stage and on the other stage operational professional discussions, that will be a very important factor to try to create relationship with the new administration of Biden. We are missing, and this is a big minus to Israel, like observe from the side. I agree with the professor, we should make on a secret way discussions, but it's not the play that we estimate to do in a regular situation.
So actually, one of the things that, thank you, Eitan, there's a lot in there, and I want to go through what we can arrive at. But the first thing I want to say is, that, Chuck, you know, a great many people who talk about a return to the JCPOA are oftentimes pigeonholed as being dovish or left of center or conflict averse or some such thing. You've actually written something in your interview that I'd like you to speak out on, because it actually connects you with Eitan's viewpoint here. And you've said, for Israel, progress between the US and Iran on a nuclear deal will allow it to focus on the vital mission, which Eitan's alluded to, on the vital mission of stopping Iran from creating a forward operating presence in Syria or transferring significant quantities of precision weapons to Hezbollah. And here you come in with a very strong quote, and it says, Israel must stop these activities at any cost, including going to war if this becomes necessary. Now, can the state of Israel prioritize the going to war that you are speaking of in order to stop the forward operating bases of Iran, with the somewhat difficult or strained relationship that we seem to be seeing between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Joe Biden? Or do you think that relationship is not strained? In other words, can your priority actually come about given the current climate between the American leader and the Israeli leader?
I think it's too early to say that there is any strain in the relationship. There may very well be one in the near future, but I don't think we're there yet, and I very much hope that we won't. And I hope that the Prime Minister has derived the appropriate conclusions from the fight with the Obama administration and will not go in that direction. Joe Biden is a lifelong friend of the state of Israel. He certainly doesn't want a conflict. Look, imagine that the JCPOA had not been signed, let me create a scenario here, that it had not been signed, and we're now 5 years later. Iran has gone nuclear in the meantime, which it could have in that period. And we had the Iranian entrenchment in Syria and the precision project primarily in Lebanon, but in Syria as well. The state of Israel would not be able to do a great deal in those circumstances. When the other side has a nuclear capability, at best you're constrained, if not rendered extremely constrained, okay? So I think from that point of view, the deal was another plus from our point of view. Now, it's not as if I don't fully share Eitan's concern about the other non-nuclear issues completely. And it's not because you said some JCPOA supporters are considered doves. I don't necessarily consider myself a dove on this issue. I consider myself a hawk on the issue. The question is how we reach the desired outcomes on the nuclear and the other issues. I think we have to go back to the old deal, not because I want to. 5 years have gone by. It wasn't a perfect deal by any means. It would be much better if we could go to a new deal now. I think to be realistic and attempt to go to the new deal means that there won't be any deal. between no deal and going back to the old deal, better do that. Now, the problem is that in going back to the old deal, the Biden administration will be forfeiting most, if not all, of the leverage that President Trump did succeed in gaining over the years. How do you get the Iranians to agree to a follow-on new deal afterwards if you've given up their leverage? Very, very hard. And we have to understand that when we talk about a new and better deal, it is by definition worse for the Iranians. So why would they agree to that unless you have severe pressure? So I don't think that this is a good situation. I'm not happy about it. But again, as someone who believes in living in the world as it is, not the world that I want to live in, I don't think we're going to have a choice in the end.
Eitan, you know, Chuck just mentioned, Eitan, that he feels it's a bit early to, and I don't actually want this to be the focus, but I do want to bring your perspective in. He feels it's a little bit early to say that there's a strained relationship between the US and the state of Israel, or maybe a strained relationship between the president and the prime minister, if I can term it as such. But you actually wrote that you believe that the United States is already giving Israel the cold shoulder. Are you referring to every aspect other than security, or are you including security issues within that? And where do you see the cold shoulder being shown, please?
Benjamin, we have to look on it that the main and the important friend for Israel in this global world is the United States. It will not be changed. Doesn't matter who will be there. It should be, maybe we are talking about how to do it. I was not surprised, maybe you, that the exchange of the administration of the presidential in the United States will cause some cold shoulder for what happened in the last years. But this is for the past. I'm looking now for the present situation. We are in a very important 2 months sensitive, while the United States going and declare on it, and they're working on it, on the interim agreement with Iran. And I agreed with Chuck that it will not be something new. It has no chance. But as you know, interim can be the end for many years. And if I may put some principle for such negotiation with the United States, first of all, we have to make it in a low signature. We have to give the mandate to our present government leaders, even maybe some of them will not be there tomorrow, to find those who are the importance for the channels from the Prime Minister and some others, to go to the United States, to find a way and to bring the Israeli position. We cannot be on it, let's say, observe it from there on the political level. You cannot base your policy on sending excellent people like the Chief of Defense Staff, the head of the Mossad, and the others. At the end, they are professional. We never had problems between understanding the intelligence world and the other part. And this world, we are very find always the way out to do and to talk. We have to climb up and to find the way in a low signature, as I said, to talk, because I tell you, will not be here a new government till probably the interim agreement will be declared. Secondly, I think that besides, for the medium term, it will take time. After we will see which government will be here, no one can now estimate. It's a very foggy situation. Maybe it will be only also half year from now, that will be fifth elections, who knows? It's a very difficult situation for Israel. As it looks, the responsibility on the shoulders of our leaders is to fulfill their mission now and not lose the time. With the United States, if you ask me to Eitan, what I prefer, what is my priorities, I prefer to find a way to say the things to the United States presidents and his staff about what is needed. Then you have also a gap with the Jewish community now because of the change. You have a gap with the Democratic Party from this year's. Probably you hear voices that we were not used to here in the past. Never mind, put it on the side. and make a very close priority and make one goal or target. The target is to delay or prevent from Iran to come to the point of no return for the nuclear, and also then build the structure for the other points that I said of preventing Iran to move ahead, and also for the weapon systems. How to do it? We have one tool by the states, temporary, and it's going to be ended probably at the end of this agreement. The sanctions that Trump declared towards Iran is a heavy weight on the Iranian shoulders. And if the American will use it in a smart way, I believe we will find a maximum, even the situation is not good for us today, as I said, that we can continue from that point ahead. So I'm sure that for the coming future, the relation between Israel and the States will be balanced, will be continue to be officially much more better. And I think another point, Biden administration are not involved in the Israeli political, they are waiting who will be the government. But on the other end, they jump immediately to the swimming pool of Iran, and also making some steps with the Palestinians, not belong to our discussion today. But it's a vacuum. Israel should be there. Israel should immediately stand and said their issues. You heard yesterday probably Benjamin Netanyahu words at the ceremony for the Holocaust evening day, the opening, and he said on his voice, but we should reduce the tones, the discussion, and find a way immediately, without any doubt, to bring it from the political level, unless we will not be on this train when it leaves the station.
Chuck, I want to speak to you about this. You're a former Deputy National Security Advisor there in the State of Israel. Eitan's spoken about this phrase of a low signature, meaning to do things a little bit more discreetly. You wrote in your paper for the MirYam Institute that these issues ought to be discussed, and I'm quoting, Israel should express its stances behind the scenes and engage in serious debate. Now, if you were there around the table today, what would you be telling the Prime Minister of the State of Israel needs to be conveyed to the United States in order for them to understand not necessarily just Israel's position on this issue, but why this is an imperative for the United States of America? And I'd like it, if you could, to tie this to the previous example of quiet discussions behind the scenes that come to my mind. And I believe prior to Israel hitting the Syrian nuclear program in 2007, Prime Minister Olmert had a very quiet, discreet meeting with President George W. Bush. He said that he wanted to deal with the Syrian nuclear threat militarily. This is Prime Minister Olmert who said that. President Bush took a different view. He said that he wanted this to go through the United Nations, a diplomatic route. They agreed to disagree. There was not a great big fanfare of conferences and public speeches in opposition to an American president's policy by an Israeli prime minister, and the issue was dealt with quietly, discreetly. Now, I realize there are strategic differences, I realize there are geographical differences, I realize there are any number of differences, but the thread that I would like you to talk to is the importance of expressing these issues quietly and how you would go about that. What would be those relevant points?
Well, I think actually the example you give is an excellent one of how a sensitive dialogue of this sort should be held. Actually, Prime Minister Olmert at the time was very much hoping that President Bush would say, oh, well, the US will take care of the problem, and that the US would launch the military strike. And the president made it clear that after what had happened in Iraq, he wasn't politically capable of doing it at that point. At which point the prime minister said, well, if that's the case, and you understand that the state of Israel will have to do what it must do to defend itself. And the president didn't say, well, go ahead. Superpowers don't usually give that quite a green light, but He basically said, okay, do what you have to do. Now, I think this is, again, to come to our issue, this is a case where Israel has a very important role to play in providing some of the critical intelligence information, just as we did in the case of the Syrian reactor, which American intelligence was not familiar with. And just as we, in 2018, I believe it was, with the Iranian nuclear file, we brought information that the US did not have. That has to continue. There has to be a very, very intimate dialogue between the senior officials on both sides on the policy level of what the different things that we can do are. I don't think we have a basic problem here, at least in terms of the objectives. American objectives are quite similar to ours. Where there is a difference is over some of the ways of achieving them. It's not surprising that a global superpower and a regional power don't have exactly the same views on things. Our security margins are quite different from the United States, much more limited. But there is a broad convergence of views. And the question is whether we want to work on the basis of that convergence or we want to exacerbate the differences and reach another crisis. Now, I think there is a basis for actually a broad strategic framework if we're willing to work with the US this time and not go against it. And it has economic, diplomatic, and military components. And without taking too much time, I'll just say that on the economic level, it starts with the fact that the non-nuclear sanctions remain in place, even if there's a new deal. It means that the US presses the international community not to violate dual-use sales to Iran. It means that there are snapback sanctions if Iran does violate. On the diplomatic level, this is an opportunity to restore the unity together with the Europeans and other players. As a matter of fact, even Russia and China will be partly on board once the US is back in the deal, because they don't want to see a nuclear Iran either. Once we've gone back to the old deal, we can try with all the limitations to reach the new deal and address the sunset issues and the inspections issues, the missiles issues, etc. I would also hold out, I wouldn't talk about regime change in Iran, because that will, and the Iranians won't go back to the deal, or they may violate it if we speak explicitly about regime change. We, in this case, being the United States, not Israel. Here, Israel, we can say what we want, but the United States can hold out a hopeful, positive image of what a future Iran looks like, and what the nature of the relationship with the United States might be. And the military component, well, first of all, we can build on the truly historic breakthrough of the so-called Abraham Accords to build a regional framework. We can make sure that both the US and Israel have credible military options in the background. I'm not sure that we both do at the moment. We can continue covert operations, whether it's cyber or otherwise, to sabotage the program. And the state of Israel, I think, has to invest more money, a lot more money, in missile defense, not so much, not against the Iranian nuclear threat, but against the Hezbollah rocket threat. Oh, and just one last point, if I may. I share Eitan's fear that a temporary deal will become the permanent deal. And of course, this deal only has 5 years left to go. So a critical question is, do we even want to go back to a deal for 5 years? As I said before, I don't think we have a choice, but the point is that in year 9, the end of year 8, the US, together with the E3, should be coming to the Iranians and saying, sorry guys, this deal doesn't end ever.
Eitan, before I come to you about something that Chuck said, I just want to ask a quick follow-up question of Chuck, and then I'd like you to weigh in on both points, if that's okay. Chuck, we held an interview with General Stanley McChrystal about 3 weeks ago. You made a point about the credible military threat, and you questioned whether or not Israel has a credible threat, a military threat on the table, the United States, or a credible military option, let's say. Stanley McChrystal was very, very forthright about the idea that the United States does not have a credible military option on the table. Now, it's important because he is one of the senior defense heavyweights with whom the Biden administration has been consulting on this issue. So Eitan made a very important point, and you've backed him up on the economic aspect, the sanctions and their efficacy, but our prime minister has always said they must be accompanied with a credible military threat, credible military option. Does that option exist in your opinion? And what do you think, having heard what General McChrystal says about the issue?
Well, first of all, I don't think that the US has a credible option on the table today. There's no doubt that the US has the capability. And if it was projecting a different deterrent image, would have a credible option once again. If the US ever goes the military route, this isn't even a major military operation for the United States. It's a limited one. For us, it's a major operation at the absolute limits of our capabilities in terms of distance, and not just distance. I don't think that there's a question that we have a capability to cause significant destruction, and we can postpone the day that Iran goes nuclear. Can we destroy the program? I don't think so. There are a couple of targets that we don't have time to elaborate on. Everybody knows are particularly critical. Let's say we can gain a year or two or three at the expense of a very severe response. Is it worth doing that for what is probably not more than 3 years? Even what's left over of the nuclear deal is 5 years, and if we can then negotiate a follow-on one, maybe we can gain a lot more.
So Eitan, Chuck made mention of the opportunities or the pragmatic options that have opened up as a result of the Abraham Accords. And while everybody's very pleased about the Abraham Accords, one country that's yet to join those accords, of course, is Saudi Arabia. And you wrote about the fact that tensions are building between Washington, D.C. and Riyadh and Saudi Arabia. How first of all, tell us where you see those tensions for our listeners, and also how do those tensions affect negatively the ability of the United States to interact with its regional partners, particularly on the issue of Iran? If we could focus on the issue of Iran, that would be ideal.
United States, I think, has a problem today because on one hand...
Eitan, I'm going to ask you to speak a bit louder. There's some audio.
Okay. Do you hear me now?
Yes, I do. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
United States, I think, has to judge and to decide between two opposite things. On one hand, they are looking for democratic area, but they have to remember, the Democratic Party, what happened by trying to push too much democratic activities to nations in the Middle East that are not prepared to it, like the Arab Spring that happened. And when you are looking on this kind, of course, everybody of us support democratic, but in the Middle East, let's call it that the principles are different. On the other hand, I think the United States at the end is based on a very important bloc that based on the Gulf countries, they are leading by Saudi Arabia. And the main change that today this bloc contain with it also Israel. And what you are looking now, that the activities of the United States has some gap or some distance from Saudi Arabia. You see it from some statements that are made towards Saudi Arabia that belong to the issue of the democratic way to handle countries, etc., like what happened in Turkey, etc., from the fact that the enemy is sitting and also shows his activities and attacked already Saudi Arabia. You see the Emirates today are in a very tense situation, also the other countries. In my opinion, United States should give for the future democratic options to continue based its policy on the bloc that has been created on the Middle East, that including today, it's like a dream. Saudi Arabia, Gulf countries, Egypt, Jordan, and even I feel some checking from Turkey to such idea. And in my opinion, the activities of the United States towards Tehran today should take on account the base they are sitting on it on the Gulf. It means with Saudi Arabia and other countries and Israel. And with your permission, I would like to jump to another point. What will be decided between United States and Iran will have a heavy impact, because you have to think also on the day after the agreement that will, the interim agreement that will be achieved. You have to put in your mind that Iran does not leave the revenge of disappearing of Soleimani and their scientific people, and they have patience to deal with it because it has a lot of damage to the deterrence of Tehran. Secondly, without any obligation of the activities of Tehran on the ground and in Syria especially, you will not succeed to create any kind of, let's say, a new field game that you need it. That is the main difference from 2015. So if you ask me, being more pragmatic, what is the principles that should be signed? I said, first of all, prevent from Iran coming back to the point of, to cross the point of return. Secondly, made obligation towards the accurate weapon system in a very clear way. Third, make it clear towards the land, the hold of Tehran in Syria and Iraq. Make it on a, I agree with Czech, the main important is the nuclear, but you have one package, unless you will miss everything, because the day after, the Iranian will not count United States and others, and we have experience for it. They have a very one mission that they are centralized on it and going to it. United States will not be able to be, as we are looking on it, as the great country in this area, that without the support and the back of their allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, and the main key to bring Iran to this issue, I, from my experience, believe as a military people that the winner against threat on such ways of killing people is economy. And the United States has the key for Iranian economy in its pocket, very close today. If they are going to move the key from the pocket, it will be another open space. On the other hand, they can have to be patient and to press the Iranian, and it's like something that every side is looking who will be the one that will give up.
Chuck, Eitan made a comment there about retaliation. And in the paper that he wrote for us, he actually outlined the fact that Israeli airstrikes on Iranian military assets in Syria and elsewhere, airstrikes, they will be answered potentially by attacks on Israeli shipping. And he was referring there in particular to the attack on the Israeli ship in the Gulf of Oman. Is that likely, in your view, Chuck, to be a repeated policy? Do we have to look out for not, Eitan made mention of the idea that the economic approach towards the Iranian challenge is one that's in our interest to pursue, but the Iranians may also take an economic tack, and given that 90% of Israel's trade is conducted via shipping, do we need to look at that as a threat in the case that we take your policy, including that of making war against these forward bases in Syria? We may pay a price, perhaps not on land, but certainly at sea.
We've been attacking the Iranians in Syria for the last probably 3 years. And according to the press reports, it's already a few hundred attacks. Till now, There have been a couple of Iranian responses, one almost a significant one of a couple of years ago in the Golan. So far, they haven't found the ability to retaliate. I think they would, the way they would like to. And partly, of course, because we're preventing them. Now, actually, there have already been 2 attacks on Israeli ships in the last few weeks. I must say, I have mixed feelings about this policy when it comes to the ships. I have no problems with the so-called the Mabam, the campaign between the wars in Syria. I have more mixed feelings about the shipping, not because, nothing in principle, just in practical terms, because we're more vulnerable here. There are Israeli ships in the Gulf, in the Indian Ocean, everywhere in the world. There's a limit to how much we can protect them. And once maybe we started it, I don't know who did it the first time, but at least according to the press reports, we've been doing it for a while now. Once you start that game, the other side can play it as well. And we have to be very, very careful. By the way, it's not just Israel attacking Iranian oil tankers. I mean, a lot of these ships are carrying weapons. The one that was just attacked a day or 2 ago down near Yemen was actually the forward operating command post for the Revolutionary Guards. There were commando dinghies on it. This wasn't just some innocent ship that we decided one day to attack. But let me, if I can, address the economic point that Eitan was making. I'm all for economic pressure on Iran. I'm all for any kind of pressure because all I want to see is the bottom line. In 2012, when the US succeeded in putting together an international coalition, and not only the Europeans, but even Russia and China got on board, and most of the rest of the world, Iran was in deep trouble economically and agreed to come to the table, and in 2015 even agreed to reach the JCPOA. It did not, even though its economy was really reeling in severe straits, it did not agree to give up the program or even to roll back the infrastructure. It agreed to postpone it. President Trump adopted his policy of maximal pressure, which caused the Iranian economy extraordinary pain. The objective isn't to cause the Iranians pain. The objective is to get them to change their policy. It failed so far abysmally. Now, I don't know, maybe 4 or 8 or 10 more years, it might have worked. But the 4 years of Trump's maximal pressure, the maximal pressure under Obama, it wasn't enough to get the Iranians to cave in. And the reason is actually that the Iranians, from their point of view, okay, I don't agree with this, but from their point of view, they have very, 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 very good reasons for wanting a military nuclear capability. And unless we understand that, we can't understand how to approach them. For them, this is the only thing to assure the future of the Islamic Republic. It doesn't look, I hope I'm wrong, it does not look like economic pressure, even combined with diplomatic pressures and credible military threats. It doesn't look like that's enough to get them to give up the program. So the question is whether we can postpone it for long enough so that maybe God will be good and things will work out.
Eitan, with what Chuck said, and I have to say, I completely agree with Chuck. I know that everybody speaks about the sanctions and we have all these descriptions of them biting sanctions and crippling sanctions and heavy sanctions and so forth, but they have not thus far achieved the goal. And as Chuck just so appropriately said, the goal is not to cause pain. The goal is to get Iran to give up their military nuclear program. Do you feel, if you were to look 5 years down the line, 10 years down, do you feel that the Iranians can be compelled to end their military nuclear program? Or do you think that we're just buying time, and eventually there will be that breakout moment?
I think you cannot close this program only by...
You would, Eitan, again. I'm sorry to ask you. Yeah, thank you. My apologies.
I think that the economy is not the only tool that we have to use with Iran, but it's the major one that will have impact about the Iranian authorities when you are looking towards the medium range or even the short range, because the problems are very deep there. I'm sure that Iran, as it's shown, is not going to stop anything, none of the nuclear program, none of their landhold program, only because economic sanctions. But, you know, the joint together or the challenge of United States to lead this economy pressure on Iran and force some Western countries not to be broken and to continue with it, it is the more, in my opinion, it has the major chance today to bring in Iran not to stop, but to create or to sign an interim agreement that will be better for both sides. And with your permission, last remark. I think we are in a very sensitive junction on the level, on the bilateral, let's say, crash between Israel and Iran, while it was moved from the strikes from the air and other kind of things to the sea field. There, Iran has some advantage because of the large fleet Iranian kept all over the area, because Israel is a small country, needs these sea routes for itself. And I think Israel should check very deeply, maybe mistake, by talking too loudly, by giving too fast official information that was published from the United States about Israelis attack on some Iranian ships. Now it's coming, few minutes ago, I got a message that one of the Iranian military spokesmen said Iran will react towards the country they are suspicious, and of course, they're meaning towards Israel. I think we climb up as Israel too fast to make it official crash, let's say without, now it was working in a way with crews, there is no casualties till now, but it can climb up to a stage that United States and other countries will be also affected from what's going in the sea area. And now we are coming to a point that should be maybe kind of discussions between United States and some other countries about the sea area, because the Iranian already has shown after the attack on Saudi Arabia that they can jump immediately to a level and attack things that will bring damage to us. Of course, they're taking their risks, but in my opinion, we should keep a secret activities, a low level, and also a low signature. And as you say, also, don't speak too much, don't speak too loud, make your work, and be more modest.
So I have a quick question on that, and then I'm going to ask a final question of both of you. Chuck, you know, you referenced an almost successful attack by Hezbollah in Israel in the northern border and in the Golan Heights, and a couple of years ago, and that was actually proclaimed. It was not successful, but Israel actually did exactly what Eitan is advising us not to do, which is they became very outspoken about how they avoided that success. What exactly would you say is the reason for the state of Israel of late stepping away somewhat from its policy of not speaking too loudly, as Eitan says, but carrying and even wielding and even deploying a big stick as and when it has to? To give our listeners an understanding of this, there's long been the notion that if our enemies or those that we are in conflict with are faced with us boasting about our effectiveness militarily against them, they will be forced to retaliate. Whereas if we're quiet and say nothing, they can almost look the other way. And to use an example of that, The Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007 is a fine example of that. It was done, it was quiet, nobody spoke about it. What accounts for this departure from that policy?
I think there have been a few departures in recent years, and I would say both for a positive reason and a negative reason. The positive reason is that I think, I don't know if this is a change from the political leadership, greater openness on the part of the intelligence community, both, or because the prime minister imposed on the intelligence community, but in any event, a greater willingness to use intelligence information for diplomatic purposes. Now, the intel people, of course, and correctly from their point of view, always want to protect sources, so they want to keep things quiet. They don't want to let anything out. And of course, we have to preserve our sources. That's critical. But in the final analysis, the intelligence information is there for a purpose. And if you can thwart military operations, if you can use intel for diplomatic purposes and achieve a greater outcome, then it has to be done. And here again, I think the prime minister may have had to have actually exert some pressure on the intel people to get them to agree to this. That's the good reason. The bad reason is that I think the political echelons have been less hesitant to use intelligence information and military activity generally for their own political purposes, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, there's obviously a lot there, Chuck, and given the brevity of the time that remains, I want to just ask one final question, short answers from each of you. Eitan, first to you. There's a lot of enthusiasm about the Abraham Accords. There's a lot of enthusiasm behind the idea that these accords came about with Iran as the central interest, the central fulcrum for everyone to coalesce around. If push comes to shove, though, how much skin in the game, really, in countering Iran's military nuclear program will any of the American allies in the region actually place? And how much skin in the game will the signatories to the Abraham Accords, including those, and how much skin in the game will the signatories to the Abraham Accords demonstrate that they have as well? So there are American allies who are not party to the Abraham Accords. There are American allies who are. If push comes to shove, how much are any of those actually going to engage within the countering of the Iranian nuclear threat? Or is this just going to come down to Israel and the United States?
That, first of all, the Abraham Agreement you mentioned at the beginning should continue to be the new base in the Middle East.
Speak up, Eitan, if you would. You're still again distant. I'm sorry.
I say again that the Abraham Agreement is a major factor that brings the change for the Middle East. And one of the main responsibility of Israel's new government that will be established is to make the discussions with the United States to continue and base the policy in the Middle East. I'm not speaking about the Palestinian issue and other issue. You have to look now on the Middle East in a large scale. And the Abraham Agreement made a great change to the Middle East, that if we are looking on it, it served the United States interest in this area. And I mean economical interest and other kind of things. When you are looking and also on the priorities of the United States that are looking on Russia, China, and other, Iran is not the main threat towards United States interest in this side of the global. It can make problems, but not for them. For us, for the bloc that was like covered like by umbrella in this area, it gives us the chance to work together and to be a very important front for the United States against this kind, especially while United States is trying to be prevented from military interview like in Iraq, in other places. They are keeping very strategic places, that are the game changer, like in the border between Iraq to Syria and other places. So on this kind of thing, I believe that above all, we cannot see Israel separate from its being the major ally to the United States in this region. We will have to calculate our steps towards a Biden administration. We have to put on account the new changes that has brought to this region from the time of Obama, because we are coming to a very much more sensitive. On one hand, we have chances, and one hand, we have threats from this kind of junction for the future.
And Chuck Freilich, last word to you, and if you could weigh in on that, how much skin in the game do America's allies in the region actually, are they actually willing to put on the line here? Or is this going to come down to Israel and America, or just one or the other of those two?
The question, of course, is how you define skin. Now, if you want, you can allow your imagination to run ahead, and one could think of where UAE and Bahrain are located geographically, and you could look at the kind of weapons that they use and the kind of weapons that we use, and you have high, if not complete, interoperability. And you could think of all sorts of really nice things that we could do together. But even if we're not going anywhere nearly that far, even if we're just doing some limited actual military cooperation, if we do some strategic planning together with some intel exchanges, if we build a diplomatic alliance to put pressure on Iran with some military aspects to it, dayenu, okay, it's just Pesach. The other Arab countries aren't going to get very involved in this. The Saudis maybe yes. Look, I think in the final analysis, there's a question how much skin in the final analysis the United States will put into this. We may be on our own if and when push comes to shove. Okay, as long as we're on a diplomatic and economic track with some military in the background, then the US and Israel, we're in this together. But if the final push comes, we don't know, okay? President Bush, who was certainly minded in the kind of way that we would have wanted in 2007, couldn't do it for domestic American political reasons. And we could be in that situation again. So that I think, and if I can make a concluding thought here, first of all, obviously we have to try and coordinate with this administration as much as we possibly can. But I am deeply, deeply, deeply concerned about where the US-Israeli relationship is heading, not under Biden. I said before, Biden is a lifelong friend. There has been a precipitous drop for support for Israel on the Democratic side, particularly the left wing of the Democratic Party. Now, it's not a question of Democrats, Republicans. The key to the US-Israeli relationship was always that it was bipartisan. We have to have support from the entire American political spectrum. And we are in serious danger. It's not irreversible, but we are in serious danger of losing the left half of the United States. And that's where, by the way, the overwhelming majority of Jewish Americans are. Now, if there is one truly existential issue from our point of view, it's the relationship with the United States. We cannot risk it under any circumstances.
Thank you very much. Professor Chuck Freilich, General Eitan Dangot, we've taken an hour of your time. You've certainly enriched and educated us. We greatly appreciate you weighing in on this. For those who are listening on the podcast or watching this, I implore them, please, to review your articles. They're available at miryaminstitute.org under your profiles in the commentary section. And Professor Freilich, I'm going to ask you to come back and discuss more in greater detail that concluding statement, incidentally, about this precipitous drop that you identified. It's obviously close to our heart here at the MirYam Institute. Eitan, I very much look forward to having you back and to hosting you at the MirYam Institute, in particular on the issue of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. That's something that you've weighed in on of late, and we would like to get an update from you in the coming days and weeks. But until that time, I just want to say on my behalf personally, on behalf of my co-founder and colleague Rosita Panini, on behalf of our colleague in common, Anna Nangra, and indeed the MirYam Institute, thank you so very much. Thank you for finding time during Yom HaShoah to talk to us about how the state of Israel can face down now, finally, in our days, those existential threats that would otherwise rise up with a view to destroying our people. Not so in the modern era, thankfully, due to the existence of the one and only Jewish state. Thank you so very much to both of you.